And you are podcasting with Gary DeMar. Let's figure things out.
There is so much crazy prophecy news going on in the world today that I really believe I could do a reality show based upon all of it. So much stuff is happening around the world. I think part of it is, of course, is that news sources are immediate. Years ago when people wrote prophecy books, and keep in mind, people have been writing about prophecy and how the Bible applied prophetically to their time, and you can see it in the literature. It goes back thousands of years, almost, well, up until right after the time of Christ. You had people predicting the end based upon what was happening in their world at that time. Frank Gummerlock has written a book for American Vision called The Day and the Hour, where he goes and he studies the history of all this date setting. Every bad guy in the world is an indication of the Antichrist. Islam, of course, the Roman Catholic Church for centuries, even the Reformation. When Reformation came along, they maintained the idea that the papacy was Babylon, the man of lawlessness, the Antichrist, and so forth, written into the Westminster Confession of Faith, which was later changed. Still, did not acknowledge that did acknowledge that the Roman Catholic Church was theologically off base, but did not identify it as the Antichrist. And I've always found it interesting that those people who deal with the Antichrist oftentimes don't actually quote the passages where the word Antichrist is found. It's found in 4 verses in John's epistles, and it's specifically defined for us, and even the timing of the Antichrists, there were many of them, makes this point. Which makes an interesting point regarding in Matthew chapter 24, the day and the hour, where Frank Gummerlock talks about the day and the hour. No one knows the day and the hour. I believe that the day and the hour that Jesus was describing in Matthew chapter 24 isn't the day and the hour of his second coming, but it was a lack of knowledge of the day and the hour of when the temple was going to be destroyed. Because that is the topic. That's what brings about the discussion that we find in Matthew chapter 24. Is that when is this going to happen? What will be the sign of the end of the age? Because the end of the covenant, the end of the temple meant the end of the old covenant age with the priesthood and the animal sacrifices, and the temple itself. If that goes away, what follows that? And so Jesus lays out what was going to happen before that generation passed away. But there is no indication specifically in terms of the timing of that, and that's why Jesus mentions no man knows the day and the hour. And now, I do not believe that Jesus specifically meant an exact day and exact hour. A day and hour is simply as something, as you get closer to the time of something, it really refers to the exact the timing of all of this, when it's all going to culminate. And it happened rather quickly once the Roman armies came in, once the fire around the temple took place, once the people, there was a lull in the battle and people escaped from Jerusalem, and then all hell broke loose soon after all of that. See, this happened very quickly, but there was a lead up generationally up until that period of time. So it's no one particular day or hour. It's simply to tell us that this Jesus was talking about. You aren't going to know the specific timing of all of this. So that's why you need to watch out, pay very close attention to what is going on. And in Luke's gospel, we hear Jesus say, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies. So we're getting very, very close to an actual day in which that was going to take place, which no one knew from the time of Jesus making this pronouncement in the Olivet Discourse and to the time it actually took place. But it did take place before that generation passed away. Then I saw this from Amazing Facts. This is a show that's often comes on Sunday morning, and this particular one is Trump Gaza, Israel, and prophecy. Of course, you know, anytime anything happens in the Middle East, we are being told it's the last days. When Israel became a nation again in 1948, that was supposed to be a signal that the end was to take place before 1988. Here we are, 2025, 77 years since the Israel becoming a nation again, far beyond the 40-year generation, now coming up to 80 years, and people are still pulling and playing the prophecy card regarding all of this. And so in this particular video that is out there, now we're finding out that Russia is back in the news, and China is now in the news, and they're using Ezekiel 38 and 39, where I guess Magog is Moscow and Gog is China, and this is based upon Ezekiel 38 and 39. Ezekiel 38 and 39 always comes up anytime anybody makes any move internationally. This is the prophecy they go to, a prophecy that was written 600 years before the time of Christ. So that means that 2,600 years have passed away, and this prophecy still was not fulfilled in any way. And part of the problem that many of these prophecy writers have to deal with is, especially because they're premillennial, is that the Gog and Magog doesn't appear until Revelation chapter 20, which is, you're talking about the end of Revelation chapter 20, which is 1,000 years after the rapture. And so this is an event that should not take place until at least 1,000 years from now. If the rapture were to happen today, the Gog and Magog battle wouldn't take place for another 1,000 years. This is a real problem with the premillennial, the dispensational view. Now, I have an answer to it because, number one, I believe Ezekiel 38 and 39 has in fact been fulfilled. It was fulfilled in 100 years or so after the prophecy was given in Ezekiel 38 and 39. I cover this in my Gog and Magog book. And all you have to do is read Ezekiel 38 and 39 and note that this is an ancient battle fought with horses and horsemen. Of course, you have Persia, Ethiopia, Put as Gomer, Beth Togarmah. All these ancient names are listed here, and they are, at that time living securely. They were unwalled villages. This talks about silver, taking away silver and gold to take away cattle and goods. They have bows and arrows, and it's crazy. And you even have here the mention of Haman, Gog, and I believe that what is being described here prophetically are the events that took place in the book of Esther, where Haman, who was a Gogite, was out to destroy all the Jews, every single Jew then living throughout the entire Persian Empire. And you can see this in Esther chapter 3. And so you get my book, The Gog and Magog End Time Alliance, where I lay this out in excruciating detail. To me, this is unanswerable. And now this is not a view that was unique to me. This was something that James Jordan put together, and I just developed it much more than Jim did. And all the parallels are unmistakable. Take, for example, verse 13, where it says in Ezekiel 38, Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish with all of its villages will say to you, have you come to capture spoil? Have you assembled your company to seize plunder, to carry away silver and gold, to take away cattle and goods, to capture great spoil? This is what the spoil was. It was very simple. It's stated very succinctly: silver and gold to take away cattle and goods, to capture great spoil. This is what Haman wanted. fact, if you read on, he wanted to be paid in silver. This was just like politicians today. He was in it for the power and the money, because the Jews had brought back gold and silver and cattle and goods from the exile. And Haman wanted that plunder. He wanted to take it away from them, and doing so, he would do it by killing all of them. Now, how do we know this? Because if you go to the book of Ezra, Ezra chapter 1, verse 2, "Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever there is among you of all his people, may his God be with him. Let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem." Now listen to this. "And every survivor at whatever place he may live, let the men of that place support him with silver and gold, with goods and cattle, together with a free will offering for the house of God, which is in Jerusalem." This was a treasure trove that Haman wanted to get. And it's exactly what you find in Ezekiel 38 and 39. Ezekiel 38 and 39 is not a prophecy about modern-day Russia. That was given up some time ago, but it keeps raising its head. Now we've added China into this, and we are misapplying Scripture. We're taking Scripture completely out of context. And what amazes me is all those people who claim to interpret the Bible literally read Ezekiel 38 and 39, where bows and arrows become missiles and missile launchers, horses become horsepower, chariots become tanks. It just amazes me. The people who claim to interpret the Bible literally just can't do it. And because they can't do it, they wreck their entire system. And so what we find in Revelation chapter 20 is like what we find with Babylon and Jezebel, is that these Old Testament types are being used in the book of Revelation in a way to depict a similar type altercation that was going to take place in the book of Revelation. Then I came across something called "Refuting Jeff Durbin's Bizarre Preterist Claims." And this is from Eyes Like Fire Ministry. And he has more than 11,000 subscribers. This, I guess, was published a few months ago. And I'll let, if Jeff Durbin wants to deal with, he can deal with it. I only want to deal with really one part of all of this, which is typical of people who try to deal with preterism, who really don't know much about it. They really don't do a very good job of trying to handle preterist arguments. So I'm going to just pick out one thing this guy says and demonstrate how preterism actually solves a lot of interpretive problems. What Jeff does is it takes Jesus' words at face value and applies them to the generation to whom Jesus was speaking. That the Great Tribulation that was described by Jesus in Matthew chapter 24 is a past event. It doesn't mean there isn't tribulation in the world today. There is tribulation in the world today, but the context there is dealing with events of that generation and the destruction of the temple and the passing away of the old covenant order. And that's what's going on there. And some of the language there is hyperbole to be clear about it, and that's not unusual, especially since the way the Old Testament uses language, similar language. But much of it is very, very literal: wars and rumors of wars, famines, false prophets, false Christs, the gospel going into the whole world, earthquakes. All of those things you can show biblically how they, in fact, were taking place before that generation passed away. And then you're stuck with what it says in Matthew 24:34, where it says, "This generation will not pass away until all these things take place." Okay, verse 33, Jesus says to that audience, "When you see all these things happen." So it's very clear that Jesus is describing a tribulation period that was going to take place before that generation passed away. And I deal with Matthew 24:21, the greatest tribulation ever was, ever will be, in my book, Prophecy Wars, and show how that particular language is used elsewhere in Scripture. Let's look at one of the arguments this individual uses in order to attempt to refute the idea that of preterism, where he says Revelation 6:1-8 says Jesus allows Antichrist to take control of the world, who goes about causing a world war leading to the death of 1/4 of the world's population.
Let's go over 10 reasons why the things in the book of Revelation could not have occurred, as well as in other places, but could not have occurred in 70 AD, the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Number one, Revelation 6:1-8 says Jesus allows Antichrist, remember whenever he's breaking the first seal, he allows Antichrist to take control of the world, who then goes about causing a world war leading to the death of 1/4 of the world's population. Now, as we all know, such an event did not occur in or around 70 AD. A quarter of the world back then would have been some 75 million people. They estimate that the world population was around 300 million back at the time of Christ.
Let's begin with the very first thing he mentions here. Talks about the Antichrist. The Antichrist is mentioned in 1 John and 2 John, and there were many Antichrists in John's day. And so when someone starts talking about what the Antichrist is going to do in the book of Revelation, it's obvious they haven't studied anything related to the definition of an Antichrist, how many Antichrists there were, and when the Antichrists were, in fact, in existence. And so we've got the Antichrist supposedly in the book of Revelation, and yet the word Antichrist isn't used anywhere in the book of Revelation. So that's number one. Number two, why does somebody go to Revelation chapter 6 when you're talking about 10 things why preterism shouldn't be true? Why the sixth chapter? Why not start at the beginning with the very first chapter? And the very first chapter is very clear that the events were to take place soon, for the time was near. That's the very first verse. And then there's the third verse, and then you go to the end of the book of Revelation, Revelation chapter 22, verses 6, 7, and 10. You see the same thing. You see the same timing words. You will find that, in fact, they're bookended by what these events must take place soon and near. Then there's John, who says he's a fellow partaker in the tribulation. And so if this is a tribulation that's going to take place in the distant future, how would John be a fellow partaker in it with something that happened in the first century, because John was alive when this was taking place? Another thing is, you've got the book of Revelation written to 7 churches that were in existence at that time. And so it's obvious that Jesus is explaining what is going to take place, and these 7 churches are going to be in the midst of this. And so why is this something that is in the distant future? In order to get around some of this, you'll find a lot of prophecy writers saying, oh, these 7 churches represent 7 ages of the church. You're reading something into the text that isn't there. And part of the problem, if you're a dispensationalist who believes in a pre-tribulational rapture that's imminent, that could happen at any time, and then you maintain that there are these 7 ages, that means the rapture couldn't have taken place during any one of the 6 ages. It's a crazy system. But then let's look at some of the language that is used in Revelation chapter 6. Now, the destruction that's being described here, I believe, is local destruction. Oftentimes when you see the word earth, it really means land. And he has down here, Revelation 6, 1-8 says, Jesus allows Antichrist. It says nothing about the Antichrist in the book of Revelation. But look at verse 12. Let's look at verse 12 of Revelation chapter 6. And this gives us some idea of the type of language that is being used descriptively here to describe this particular judgment. And this type of judgment is taken, in many cases, right from the Old Testament. So if you go back to the Old Testament to see how that language is used, you can figure out how it's being used here in the book of Revelation. So verse 12, and I looked when he broke the sixth seal, and there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth made of hair, and the whole moon became like blood. Again, borrowed language from the Old Testament. Look at verse 13. And the stars of the sky, really the stars of heaven, fell to the earth as a fig tree casts its unripe figs when shaken by a great wind. And the sky was split apart like a scroll when it is rolled up, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places. And the kings of the earth and the great men and the commanders and the rich and the strong and everywhere slave and free men hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains. And they said to the mountains and the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the presence of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. Now, so look at this. So what it says here, that stars fell from the sky, fell from heaven to earth. Now remember, let's take his view that this is in the future and this hasn't happened yet, but it will happen sometime in the future. And this is the 6th chapter. That means stars will fall to the earth in the 6th chapter, and that this can in fact be avoided by going into caves. Look, if this happens, if you've ever seen the movie Armageddon, you'll know the whole earth would have been destroyed by this time. And so this is obviously language borrowed from the Old Testament. This is judgment language. Sun, moon, and stars language is used from the Old Testament. You can read about it in Isaiah chapter 13, verse 10, and destruction of Babylon. This type of language is typical of judgment language. So if you even take his futuristic view and say that this hasn't happened yet, but it's going to happen. So in the 6th chapter, we've got the earth completely destroyed because these stars fell from heaven. And if a single star even got close to earth, earth would be completely devastated. And he cannot deal with this given his particular system. Then we go to chapter 12. Remember, the earth was completely destroyed in Revelation chapter 6. But when you get to Revelation chapter 12, we see something very interesting. Remember, we're taking his view, and this is something that's going to take place in the future during this great tribulation. Verse 7, and there was war in heaven, Michael and his angels waging war with the dragon. So there is a literal dragon that's going to be doing this. And the dragon and his angels waged war, and they were not strong enough, and there was no longer a place found for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who was called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. Now, so where in the world do we find this dragon in the future? But if you go up a little earlier in verse 3, it says, and another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon having 7 heads, and 10 horns on his heads were 7 diadems, and his tail swept away 1/3 of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, it might devour her child. So here we have chapter 12. Now, if this is describing something that has taken place in the past, you still have a problem with a dragon, a literal dragon, and a dragon with using his tail to throw 1/3 of the stars of heaven down to earth. And he's concerned about, the number of people who are going to be destroyed. Earth would have been destroyed in Revelation chapter 6. Earth would have been destroyed in Revelation chapter 12. This language is typical of judgment type language. And so you got to take the whole ball of wax here when you start interpreting the book of Revelation. You just can't cherry pick places and say, oh, this never happened, so therefore it's going to happen. Well, if stars falling from heaven haven't happened, it's going to happen. Then you've got a problem, because when you get to chapter 13, all of a sudden we've got this beast that's we're told, is going to plant microchips in us and going to control us from around the world. Then I'm thinking, wait a minute, the earth was just destroyed in chapter 6. It was destroyed again in chapter 12. But now we're gonna have a technological advanced culture in Revelation chapter 13. This is the problem with prophetic speculation today. No one pays attention to the actual context of Scripture, and neither do they pay attention to the type of language that is used. And when you get to Ezekiel 38 and 39, the language there is not symbolic. It's very, very literal. Horses, people can understand horses. People can understand soldiers on horses. People can understand bows and arrows. People can understand chariots and so forth. Everybody can understand gold, silver, cattle, and goods. The language there is very contextually historic, since it mentions very specific individuals and nations. When you get to the book of Revelation, you're looking at a different type of language, and that genre language has to be interpreted in terms of its particular context and how it's used consistently throughout the book of Revelation. We offer a book by David Chilton called Days of Vengeance. It goes through all of this. You get some flavor of it. I would even recommend Ken Gentry's 2-volume commentary on Revelation, where he goes into great detail in all of this. I don't agree with everything in Ken's commentary. Hey, I don't agree with everything in any particular commentary. Some things I have questions about, but Ken deals with this. He would just destroy this type of argument. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people who listen to this and say, oh, this guy's telling the truth because these things could not have happened. Well, if they could not have happened, I guarantee you they will not be able to happen and still have an existing earth where you get to chapter 19 and chapter 20, where supposedly we're going to reign on the earth with Jesus for 1,000 years. But you just destroyed it in Revelation 6 and Revelation chapter 12.
Thanks for podcasting with Gary DeMar. Please subscribe and share this with anyone you think really needs to hear it.